Thank you for joining us for our sixth and final NASIO NGA Comprehensive Statewide Energy Planning 101 webinar conversation. We appreciate you all joining on at least in DC, gloomy Thursday afternoon. So appreciate you taking the time. Really excited to have this conversation. So far, we've talked almost everything we can about energy planning. We've talked about how you start a plan, how you set up governance, the type of data that you might be interested in pulling in, how do you put equity concerns into a plan. And I think finally we've reached what, for me at least, is the real crux of the issue. We have so far talked a lot about the plan itself, how you create it, and now we're at the point where we have a great plan baked in. Your governor's office, your agency has put a lot of time and effort and thought into these plans. You have a fully baked plan, details everything about your state or commonwealth or territories, energy goals, and now we get to start implementing them, what we do with the plan once we have it fully baked. And that's the topic of the conversation today. We've pulled in a couple of specialists to have this conversation. We're really excited to talk about how to take that plan and pull it off the shelf and put it out into the world and get credit for all the great work that you and your peers have done. So before we get into that, just wanted to say thank you again for joining us on behalf of National Governors Association, the National Association of State Energy Officials. It's been a lot of fun planning this with my colleague Sam Kramer on the line. And also wanted to give a thank you to our generous sponsors from the Department of Energy on the NGA side, the Grid Deployment Office and Office of Electricity generously sponsored it. And on the NASIO side, I believe it was the State Community Energy Program Office did it. So thank you to our friends over at DOE for allowing us the resources to do this kind of work. So without further ado, we will introduce our panelists, spend a little time talking. And as always, we'd really love your thoughts and questions. We've got a couple of experts today and would love the have good conversation. Any questions that you have on implementation of these plans, these are the great folks to talk about it. So as we're kicking off, and it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Regley. He's the Executive Director for Critical Investments from the Office of Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Brian is someone that we work with a lot on the federal infrastructure packages that have come down over the last few years and is very active in and around the NGA space and always generous with his time. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
And from the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have Ryan Welch, the Energy Technology Analyst and Systems Modeler for the Virginia Department of Energy. Eagle-eyed viewers might remember Ryan actually spoke on a previous one, and such was the quality of his comments. We've tapped him a second time, so we really appreciate the time, Ryan. So before Sam and I get to some questions and thoughts we have, why don't we send it to Brian and then Ryan, talk a little bit about your role with the Commonwealth, the type of work you do, and how you see, begin to pull those threads of implementation together.
So thank you, Chris. So my job basically as Executive Director of Critical Investments is a little bit of John Podesta for those who follow the White House IRA implementation and a little bit of Mitch Landrieu for those who have been following the IIJA implementation. And I have a great group of colleagues in the governor's office and the Department of Environmental Protection that are really, focusing on the energy plans that the governor has put forth. I would characterize Chris's, framing of this, from a state perspective as really having three main components. The first is you got to sell the plan. You may have a plan, you may think you have a plan, but it's not really always your plan because it's got to have legislature, it's got to have third parties. There's all sorts of people that have to buy into the plan. So I'll tell you a little bit about the plan that we built and the effort that we were making to sell it, right? There is the implementation of the things, but there's really two elements of that implementation. The one is how you're engaging the private sector. And obviously each state's going to be a little bit different because of the regulatory environment in the states. For those who don't know, Pennsylvania is a merchant generation state. We have nothing but independent power producers. So selling a vision of new energy involves direct engagement with the private sector and how the private sector operates. But at the same time, because of the nature of the Inflation Reduction Act and the federal funds that are coming through, there's a whole variety of things that you could use as tools, decisions that are in alignment with the policies that you're trying to promulgate. So that's the framework that I would suggest we think about today's exercise with. For Pennsylvania, there are programs that we have put forward earlier this year. One is known as PRESS and one is known as PACER. And without going through the anagrams and the details, it's really basically this. PRESS is an updated alternative energy standards. It's our renewable energy standards. But instead of focusing on only renewables, we are focusing on transition technologies as well. So there's literally more than 20 different forms of energy that we're trying to incent through, essentially renewable energy credits, a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 mechanism, everything from hydrogen to geothermal baseload to small modular nuclear reactors, fusion, anything you can think about. And we're trying to change the conversation in Pennsylvania with that type of proposal. Usually when you look at Pennsylvania, you think about the fact that we are 30% nuclear, we're 50% natural gas, about 17% coal, 16% coal. That's going to diminish and go away over the next few years. And we export 35% of our electricity. So the more types of energy that we can natively develop and innovation we can natively create in Pennsylvania, the better. So from the diversity of attributes and resources, that's where we start. Change and from the goal of reducing emissions, so we're leaning into technologies that aren't just carbon free, but also provide for transition for hydrocarbon companies. So, for instance, geothermal is a really cool opportunity. Hydrogen is a really cool opportunity because it aligns with how the natural gas industry functions and our support for natural gas as a transition tool as we move from one energy complex to an energy complex of the future. So that's really the basis of the plan. Selling it is a challenge because we in Pennsylvania, as you probably know, we're a swing state. We're a little swingy, as they like to say these days, right? We have a Senate that's controlled by the Republicans. We have a House that's barely controlled by the Democrats. We have a very, a population that reflects our legislative, branch, balance. And so to do anything, you got to convince 15 to 20 Republican senators it's a good thing. And a majority of the Democrats in the House, that's a good thing. And you can imagine that becomes a bit of a challenge. So in the midst of a world where, as I'm sure if you're following this industry, we have a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania that Talon runs, Susquehanna, that was essentially now, going to migrate to support a data center for Amazon. The new Crane Clean Energy Center, which is the old 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant that Constellation runs, that's going to be turned on to support data for Microsoft. There's all activity that's now flooding into the zone. And unlike many states that are constrained by the transmission corridors that exist, Pennsylvania is actually in reasonably good shape, relatively speaking, because once upon a time, we had literally dozens of coal-fired power plants that were generating the backbone of the grid for PJM, our ISO. So positioning new assets within the power pools in Pennsylvania is actually a little bit less of a challenge than perhaps it is if you're trying to cite, wind in the middle of Wisconsin or Idaho or some other state in the West. So it's really a question of how do you align land use opportunities, local communities, and lean into the things that they want to do. Because ultimately, it isn't just about what the state priorities are to be able to say this flavor of energy in this particular location. It's about what those local communities want to do relative to the energy heritage that they have. So Pennsylvania as a state has, generally speaking, liked getting its energy from the ground rather than the sky. And that doesn't mean that you ignore wind and you ignore solar, but you recognize the fact that a lot of the workers that are in those communities understand what fracking is. They understand how turbines work. They understand how heat works. They understand how pipes work. They're union laborers that are used to managing all of these efforts, right? So your engagement with the private sector is also your engagement with the union leadership in order to sell these projects and try to find a way to catalyze these opportunities. Did a new power plant in probably about 20 years. So we're in the business of relearning with our private sector partners how that process moves forward. And so now you go to the federal and you say, okay, what's happening at the federal level and how do we take some of the funding streams that are coming down and capitalize them in useful ways so that they align with the policy, allow us to sell the policy better, and maybe actually catalyze some actual projects. And I would love to talk about some of the projects that we're working on. Unfortunately, many of them are behind the veil of confidentiality agreements and relationships that we're trying to build. But suffice it to say that between the GRIP program, between the IRA tax credits, which are crucial to any of these investment strategies, some of the individual capacity building grants we've been able to organize, things that we've done with the EPA for RISE PA, which is our climate pollution reduction grant program that focuses specifically on industrial decarbonization. These have given us a variety of tools that we certainly wouldn't have had 2 or 3 years ago relative to the objectives that I'm describing. So in an ideal world, what are some of the projects that we can work on? I'm going to describe one to you that is publicly known and to just kind of give you some context. CNX is a natural gas provider in Pennsylvania, second largest natural gas provider. For those who understand what happens at the Utica Shale, and I don't because I'm not a geologist, but at the bottom of the Utica Shale wells, about 10,000 feet, you actually find heat sources of about 250 degrees. So as you're extracting the natural gas, you're also releasing pressure, which you can use to liquefy the natural gas. And you can start drawing on the heat source to use some of these enhanced geothermal technologies that produce baseload electricity. So now all of a sudden you look at a world where we have literally tens of thousands of active wells in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and unfortunately hundreds of thousands of abandoned wells. And you can start asking some really cool questions about how to capitalize energy sources that previously existed, environmental injustice that needs to be remediated, and the need for baseload power, both for the grid and for the hyperscalers that are coming to Pennsylvania. Those are the opportunities we try to catalyze, lift up, bring federal funding to, make sure that the tax credits are incorporated into all this, and align it with a plan with the long-term hope that we're going to sell not just the legislature, but the public of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on exercising and executing that vision.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate those opening thoughts and really articulating the complexity that putting one of these plans out, all the players and all of the stacked opportunities that kind of go into this. And so, Ryan, give us a little bit of Virginia's perspective on planning. You are a little bit unique in that you have a legislative mandated plan, so you're planning and implementing at the same time, basically on a rolling basis.
Yep. So first, I'm gonna apologize for Director Davis's absence. The governor had an immediate needs project that the director was pulled into, so I'm acting as a bit of a pinch hitter here, and so my introductory statements are not going to be nearly as polished and refined as Brian's were. But as Chris mentioned, so Virginia is in kind of a unique place where for every governorship in the first year of their administration, they're required to submit an energy plan to the legislature, and the Virginia Department of Energy is an essential part in that planning process. We provide expertise and kind of the actual landscape and the reality of the energy situation in the Commonwealth. Part of that energy plan also includes an update on the third year of every administration. And that is, generally speaking, it could be as significant as a complete redo of the energy plan, or it could be as I guess not insignificant, but as simple as we are continuing to work on the updates from this plan, and here's the progress that we've made so far. And so that provides Virginia with a unique place of being able to constantly update and reevaluate where we are at in this energy transition, what we need to be successful as a Commonwealth. The law laid out, the Virginia Clean Economy Act in 2020, is now the reality of that energy landscape in Virginia is very different from what we saw in 2022 and now in 2024 and what we expect to see in 26, 28, and 30. And so it provides us with good stepping stones to meaningfully further the energy transition and secure Virginia's energy future, essentially. And I can go into more detail into the questions, or if you have any immediate follow-up. But that is basically all I had prepared right now until we get into questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. We do appreciate you pitch hitting last minute, and also would be remiss. We had a third panelist slated to join us, but they unfortunately came down with a little bit of illness in the lead up to it. So just wanted to set that aside and wish them a quick, swift recovery. So why don't we go ahead and just get into a little bit of discussion around some of these themes. I mean, really, the planning process itself is fulsome, is complicated, and you do a lot of work to get to this point. But really, implementation, as both your opening comments touched on, is even more complicated. You have these detailed strategies, an energy plan, a governor's viewpoint on what the state energy should be, and then you start trying to turn that into actual projects. And so, I know, Brian, you talked about it a little bit. Would you go into a little bit more detail, just that process? How do you take these kind of conceptual planning ideas and turn that into projects on the ground? Or how do you sell that to outside parties, to environmental groups? Really, what's the process look like in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
I would start by saying that the Inflation Reduction Act changes the role of government in terms of its ability to generate capital and investment for specific types of projects. So there's a subset of projects that I would lean into consistent with the governor's objectives and energy policies that could actually be generated by government activity, balance sheet, income statement, cash flow that government can use in order to obtain direct pay tax credits. And again, I'm sure you've all heard this before. If you haven't, I'm going to say it again. Not-for-profits and governments could obtain a tax credit, a direct cash payment from U.S. Department of Treasury equal in value to what a for-profit company would get by building the same 48C or relevant tax credits. So what does that do for us? It creates opportunities to finance solar for schools, where our legislature passed $25 million. Again, Republicans and Democrats, we got something done to help finance that. We want to follow on with that with about $100 million of additional debt financing that we can then use as a layer of equity and debt for grants and loans, and essentially help reduce the economic and financial energy burden for schools. Do the same thing for municipalities. Do the same things for not-for-profits. And anything that we can do that directs the balance sheet of government and allows essentially savings to be generated from capital investments, which is really how you reduce inflation. You sort of drive costs out of the business, right? Do the same thing for government. So those are some of the things that we can do. In order to accomplish that, you need to build certain capacity within the government infrastructure, right? You've got to have a team of people that understand the tax credits, which is starting from scratch because these are completely new concepts. You need to have financing mechanisms and vehicles in place that allow you to do that, so you can basically manage the cash flows of those individual projects. And then the extent to which you always have to consider, you need local suppliers, people who are willing to do, Buy America, Build America, people who are willing to do prevailing wage, and lean into those opportunities to create those projects. So in all of these cases, it's creating stakeholder relationships within government to help government make certain investments that are good for government. But that's a much smaller subsector than really the private sector activity, because ultimately, because Pennsylvania is not a regulated state the way I believe Virginia is, in the sense that the PUC does not rate base, energy plans in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we are simply working with the independent power producers that see an opportunity to create shareholder value and accretive cash flows out of energy projects. So the model for us is going to be very, very different. It's not like we go to the PUC and knock on the door and say, hey, we did an energy plan. We think we need, 3 new power plants that are going to provide baseload. We, at the same time, have to work with PJM, and blew up a couple of weeks ago can now be either refined or be used as a signal to help see what other kinds of build we can accomplish in Pennsylvania. And since we export, as I said before, 35% of our electricity, really the balance of PJM depends upon our ability to continue to maintain that level of capacity to share with our other states, right? So there it's about talking to basically anybody that comes in, try to figure out what technologies they choose, how they choose those technologies, try to convince them, try to use the federal funding to match with the things that they want to do and the types of investments that they want to do, and encourage them to move down that pike. Now, I mean, we do have certain levers. The permitting process can be easier. It can be harder. We have, other types of capital investment that we can contribute. The legislature gave us $400 million to run a program called Sites PA, which is in our economic development shop. That's specifically designed to help make sites prepared for other developments. And energy is one of the key tentpole project areas that are going to come out of Sites PA. So this is a circumstance where, again, developer comes in, there's an old coal-fired power plant that needs to be refired or has been shut down, and it's just a brownfield. It's been sitting there for 5 years. But, the transformer is still there, and the interconnection to the grid is still there. And you acres of land. You can imagine all kinds of transformative opportunities for those kinds of projects that, again, 2, 3, 4 years ago, before the Inflation Reduction Act, before the hyperscalers, before deep decarbonization, those were just pieces of land that nobody ever thought would be worth anything and would ever be used again. But yet now, that's the access, that's the focus of the work that we're doing every day, because the interest in generating energy on those sites and to find users for that proximate supply for those sites is extraordinarily strong.
Thank you, Brian. Brian, a similar question. You mentioned you are updating the plan pretty frequently. Maybe folks are not as familiar with the Virginia system, but you also have a term limit of 1 term consecutively per governor. And so because of that, you're not just having a new plan update, you're having a new administration basically by structure and design as you go. And so could you talk a little bit about navigating some of the complexity that Brian talked about, sites that were brownfield sites that are maybe now being relooked at versus, within the new framework of a new administration every 4 years with the new energy plan. How do you kind of track that moving target?
So, as Chris mentioned, the governorship of 1 term does make it challenging. A lot of times, by the time they start to realize what is the reality of the energy landscape, they have half their term left or 3 years of their term left, depending on how quickly they pick up on the actual topics. And so that can make it very difficult, as well as we are also a swing state. Well, so governor-wise, we're a swing state, is how I'll say it. And so we can very much go back and forth. And so even though the 22 energy plan is all American, all of the above, and intended to be bipartisan, there is that back and forth that goes on between each large energy plan release. And to Brian's point, the IRA and just what's happened in the last 2 to 4 years has really shifted where the energy landscape is, and as a result, the energy plan where it needs to be in the Commonwealth. We are looking at brownfield sites. How can we repower those? We talk to PJM all the time to better understand what the actual needs of Virginia are and what the reliability, affordability, and increasingly clean, how do we deal with that energy trilemma that Virginia and many other states are facing, engaging with stakeholders. Within our first energy plan, we received over 700 comments, and we reached out to over 100 different private companies and interacted with them. And I think there's something to be said about doing all of that and trying to get as much feedback as possible so that when you do release the plan, you have as much support and momentum going forward so that when you start to bring these items up to the legislature, they have that feedback and the necessary support behind them to actually have that momentum to carry them on. I think I answered your questions. If you have any, once again.
It's a really good point there about how many comments you got on your last energy plan and how many folks wanted to jump in. When you're implementing the current energy plan, how have you been able to continue to engage with those folks now that the plan is actually operational? You know, they provide a lot of input, but how do you continue the momentum there?
So a lot of it is just continued engagement, having those good relationships, those deep relationships within the energy office that allows us to have the conversations that need to be had as energy plans are adapted and evolved, and as things change even between energy plans. In 23, Virginia had 2% load growth, and now the DOM zone in Virginia has 5.5 to 6% per annum load growth. And so being able to go to our stakeholders, our big data users, such as data centers with the Data Center Coalition, go to our cooperatives, our utilities, and our independent power producers, because we have those relationships is really key to making sure that we are continually working towards a successful energy future in the Commonwealth.
Great. Brian, what about you? How are you in working with some of these folks? And now that you're planning
of being a swing state is that everybody wants to engage you all the time about the things that you are trying to do at so many different levels. The reality is there are different economies in Pennsylvania. There are different economic groupings in Pennsylvania. And so their interest in and focus on energy policy vary substantially, right? You can imagine a Philadelphia area that, is certainly interested in and has a heritage, an energy heritage as well. The city is the largest municipally owned gas works in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of energy, in the Southeast, but it's not necessarily the focus of the everyday politics and everyday engagement. There certainly is the environmental community, which is more centered in Philadelphia than any place else in the state, that is going to be, the most regular advocates for the continuing push towards, cleaner and ultimately clean, firm power. When you stretch into the middle of the state, which has traditionally been where, the coal and natural gas communities are formed, their interest in job creation and economic vitality is just as real. It's just a different set of stakeholder relationships. So the big challenge there is, I will say, you can't show up in those communities and just, do something performative and say, hey, problem that the local community has thought is the problem. They're looking at it and saying, hey, we've got complex that we have. Why can't we just keep doing what we're doing the way we're doing it? So, the work that needs to be done there is to help people recognize the fact that change does not necessarily eliminate their job, that there are new jobs that will emerge as a result of the change that happens. And in some cases, they are better jobs. In some cases, they are healthier jobs. And in some cases, they're jobs that could even pay more. So, doing that within the context of job training and union outreach becomes a really important feature as well, because ultimately you want to create the social support for the kinds of activities that are relevant and sort of lift up the ones that are really about job creation, economic vitality, and not just kind of promising and saying things that sound nice to the ears, frankly, of people in Philadelphia that don't really sound nice to the ears of people in Indiana County. Meanwhile, you sort of go to the far side now and you're in Pittsburgh and you're in sort of Erie in the western side of the state, and you have the manufacturing base, you have this sort of change to robotics and AI, and a lot of the hyperscalers are probably going to position themselves as they come to Pennsylvania into that zone. Especially given the fact that latency on the fiber between Pittsburgh and the Pentagon is only like 18 milliseconds. So we're not as good as Virginia, obviously, but Virginia's pretty damn good. So, there are people who are looking at this and saying, hey, what do we do? Because it's really hard to get good, power for hyperscalers in Virginia, although everybody's trying to do it. We're kind of a migration point. We're an out migration point. And of course, you have all of these, national transmission programs that basically want to pull electrons through Pennsylvania to Virginia to try to satisfy some of this. So there's kind of an interesting balancing act from an infrastructure perspective. I think we're going to see in the East Coast over the next 3 to 5 years. So again, there, the constituency outreach is really about finding the proximate users, right? Because if that's the case, that's where a lot of our power demand is going to emerge. So again, proximate supply, proximate demand, in order to balance what's needed in the pool, that's the ideal policy scenario. Now, I say this again within the context of not having a legislative requirement like what Ryan has, and I'm sure his plan is absolutely much more organized and structured because of the routine of doing it, right? Pennsylvania hadn't done an energy plan for 20 years before we showed up. Not because the previous administrations were making a mistake, but because things hadn't changed. It wasn't like anybody was reporting a huge, increase in energy demand. It wasn't like anybody was saying, "Oh my God, we're going to go from, what was Ryan's comment, like 3% to 5.5%, whatever it may happen to be." I mean, if Pennsylvania does half of the increase that Virginia sees in its projections, we're going to need to build, 10 to 15 new power plants in the next decade, right? Yeah. Just to maintain our competitive advantage. So that becomes the question of local zoning, local relationships. What are you willing to build? What are you going to say yes to? That's always the biggest challenge. What are you going to say yes to? Because if we show up and there's local resistance to the things that we want to do, we're not going to get any place. So I think, the answer to your question is there is a natural, outreach process that is part of discussing any of these projects. It's very different in different parts of the state. It connects to the local interests in those individual states, and it requires a lot of listening, a lot of outreach, and a lot of getting out of your office in Harrisburg and actually going to the place and letting people yell at you a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then understanding what that means for the project you're trying to support.
If I can speak up real quick to Brian's point earlier about the feds doing NTSEs trying to pull power out of Pennsylvania to Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned this in the last panel I was in. I think it's really important to really, when we're doing the energy plan in Virginia or in Pennsylvania or in any of the PJM states or any of the Eastern Interconnection states, for lack of a better word, is to understand what are the energy policies in those other states doing that affects your energy policy. You have states like PJM who do a great thing in the export power, but there are a lot of states in PJM who are net importers and who are, frankly, having serious reliability issues beyond just the whole PJM system. I'm just kidding. Maryland has a lot of issues. I'll dog on them because PJM has dogged on them, so I can easily do that. And so there is serious concern if Virginia just continues to look at its energy policy in a vacuum of, even though we say we're in PJM, we don't go, okay, well, these are what these states are doing. Here are the policies they're putting forward or they're thinking about. Here are what the grander system is going on. We're ultimately setting ourselves up for failure.
And
so
Ryan,
I think that's a really good point that Brian was making. I just wanted to double down on that.
And if you don't mind, I'll triple down on it, Ryan, because I think that is the key point that would come out of any of these conversations, right? Yeah. The energy mix of one state affects the energy mix of all states. 100%. And I've heard too much from the leadership of various organizations that, well, all we just need to do is just a couple more, combined cycle gas plants and it'll all be fine. It's like, that's not the way the world is evolving here. It's moving much more rapidly than that. The world of dispatchable, centralized energy resources is done. It is over. We are moving to a highly distributed, highly decentralized way to generate electrons and distribute electrons. And the grid companies and the power companies that are willing to invest in that will win the future. And those who don't, are going to go the way of the dodo bird. Now, it's going to take longer than it did in the telecommunications industry. I mean, I'm old enough to have actually lived through that, having worked in the 80s, 90s, thousands, and so forth and so on. But it happened. I mean, eventually you got to the point where the phone companies all became, cellular companies, and they all became data companies, right? Dial tone is no longer a thing. So, it is a thing, but not really a thing anymore. So, the challenge that I think we all need to discuss is, how do the unique energy mixes of individual states, when combined, provide for the reliability we need, right?
And the affordability.
And affordability. And, if New Jersey can't do offshore wind for like 5-10 years, it goes out, and it's like, because the price points have gone too high and it's just not going to come in, and it becomes politically infeasible, which is, again, a challenge. Now, there's a whole bunch of electrons that somebody believes is going to show up in 2031 that just ain't going to be here. So you're absolutely right. And this is where I think, PJM is not doing enough, and we've said this to them directly, so I'm not saying anything publicly we haven't said, because, they're going to power and decide how they want to do things, and that's not where we need to be. And then on the flip side of that, not to criticize our federal partners, FERC is not really empowered to enforce, because all it does is it licenses, essentially, it provides permission for these power pools to work, and so those regulations, don't really give anybody ownership over the problem.
Right.
So, we are in a world where states need to step up. You guys in Virginia are, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the politics of it any given year, I'm sure, mandated to do it. So God bless you. We're not mandated to do it, but we're trying to do it. Other states, if you're not doing, you need to do it, because ultimately you will be at a disadvantage, because then states like Pennsylvania and Virginia that are producing the power are going to do things to protect our own population and our own affordability, because we're going to be forced to do so by our voters. And then your voters are going to get upset. So that's a very gentle way of saying, call Ryan, call me, call the people who are like doing this if you're not doing this. Because if you've sat through 6 of these sessions and you still haven't contemplated doing it, you really need to start doing it.
Yeah, and I think this is great with having both of us be PJM states. We can both go like, yeah, there are serious issues that the capacity auction in July didn't show that, and then the upcoming one in December. So
yeah,
and I think a couple of your points of like natural gas, and Virginia agrees with that. We recognize that, like I said, all of the above, and we need natural gas, and it's very easy to say, okay, well, we need X amount of X gigawatts of new natural gas capacity, and that's great. Well, then we need pipelines, and then we need upstream production, and then it's like all of these things that then have to go right in order to make that happen. And it's all very hard not to get ahead of the schedule of this conversation by any means. So like this is all very hard to do beyond just saying like these are the resources we need. Okay, well, what are the steps to get us to those resources, and what are the identifying in our energy plans the key leverage points that drive those? Because it's one thing to just say this is what we should do. Okay, well, how do we effectively get there? And we can do a whole lot of stuff that isn't effective or like moves the needle a little bit to help push us towards our goals. But what are the real key leverage points that allows us to provide a reliable electricity system, affordable electricity, and is also increasingly clean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like both of you have really gotten a lot of lessons out of the recent processes you've done with these energy plans, and given those lessons that you've just told us about, about how in keeping an eye on your neighbors is really important, making sure you're staying involved with these key stakeholders. What would you end up building into the process for your next plan if you had to start it over, like say today or in the next week? What would you say you'd want to build into that plan to make sure that you can, better incorporate those lessons and make for a better planning process?
So I'm sure it's a different answer to Ryan, because I bet you Ryan knows what Virginia's need is for electrons and molecules, because you've got a baseline, you've built a baseline. We had to start from scratch on building a baseline. Not because Dave Altoff and our team, we had information certainly, but that question of like, what is the official view of the governor's office regarding a future demand profile? Separate from what the PUC will tell us, or separate from what the individual EDCs, the distribution grid companies are going to tell us. And that's not because we don't believe them, but because again, it's muscle memory. It's like, what's the thing that you need to do, right? Part of the challenge, I think, has been in both Democratic and Republican leaning states is this general sense that like, we just need more of it. Like more energy is good because more is cheaper, because supply meets demand. And like everybody knows that, right? We have more electrons, it's better, right? But that's not actually true. The problem is you need the electrons where they need to be used at the time they need to be used. And that's the physics of, sending an electron from one place to the other and pushing it through the grid and making sure that the light switch goes on. So, the question of like how you construe your baseline power requirements in your state in terms of your state's needs. But then, and this is very important to Pennsylvania and Virginia, perhaps less so than some of the other people listening in, is there a competitive advantage that the energy market gives your state? And are you trying to maintain that, expand that, change that, shift that, whatever it may happen to be? Or, or essentially you're looking at a deficit, and you're trying to figure out how to supplement that, or trying to move away from that deficit. Maybe you are completely comfortable being an importer of electricity. Ultimately, it shouldn't matter in a country where we have diverse energy sources and broad availability of these energy sources, right? But for the next 3 to 5 years in particular, we're all going to have to make decisions about the investments that we think are right for our states. But you're going to do that within the context of knowing what your state needs. And that's got to be your baseline to start with. And then from there, it's that question of what else might we want to do to exploit our competitive advantage or supplement the resources so that we mitigate our competitive disadvantage in various areas of the energy markets. And that's when you have to get your governor involved. And that's when you have to have a governor who is actually willing and interested to talk about energy policy. And most governors hopefully are thinking about national interests as well as their own individual state interests. And you're thinking about a country that needs to have energy security and needs to maintain economic environment. And you're going to need to have AI factories to compete against the Japanese AI factories. Sorry, the Chinese AI factories. We like the Japanese and the South Koreans a little bit, So I'm not trying to. You should be using the right geopolitics here. I'm stuck for a moment. These are the times where you got to figure out what the right investments are, right? So I think what I would have done differently is probably start from that competitive advantage and disadvantage and work it back a little bit more. And ultimately, then I think the engagement with our neighbor states becomes really important. Some cases we've succeeded in that. In other cases, it's been a little bit less robust. But I think you would want to start with that conversation around what other states want to collaborate on this, and how does it affect their policy decisions. So that would be my somewhat elliptical answer to your question there, Sam.
So my thoughts are similar to Brian's, and I've got a couple other points I'd like to add. So similar to Brian's, you have to realize that utilities, a lot of existing electricity infrastructure asset or natural gas distribution, those are decade-long investments that are being made and are being earned on, and we are moving to a much shorter depreciation schedule with a lot of the renewables. And so getting your independent power producers, your merchant generators, or in Virginia's case, your utilities to switch to that model is something they will hesitate to do. It is not something they are comfortable with or familiar with. Utilities move at the pace of turtles. We know this. And so realizing that as you're going into this process, and that it takes a while for these decisions to be implemented and actually executed on, is really important, because you don't want to make a decision now that is going to finally come online 10 years later and have negative impacts. The other thing is that because these timelines and these lags are so long, you need to build in natural hedges. To us, nuclear is a natural hedge. Yes, storage prices have continued to fall, but to get to that clean firm that we will eventually need, long duration energy storage prices will have to be competitive with other sources. And right now that is not the case. It is likely that it will be the case. But if we wait 10, 20 years for that to happen and it doesn't, and then we decide we need nuclear, well, that's another decade or 5 years to a decade that you have to wait to get a nuclear plant online. And so you can make investments in a decision tree of sorts in order to make sure that you will have a secure, reliable, affordable energy future. And so doing that, investing in those different resources, having the contextualization of, okay, if this, then this, else this, works out well in your favor. Brian, you were going to say something.
Ryan, you're making an excellent point there, especially on the long duration storage, which I should have leaned into a little bit earlier, right? One of the main reasons why the PJM market is failing is because there are requirements for what constitutes reliability.
Yeah.
Almost all the renewable developments, and certainly in Pennsylvania and a lot of PJM, actually don't have the ability to bid into the market construct because they don't have 10 hours of storage, right? At the minimum, and this is actually something that the governor's energy policy already baked in, because my colleague Jacob Finkel was like, and David Althoff was like, this is what we got to do. We got to have storage. We got to have batteries, right? So there's separate incentives in those policies for batteries. And beyond just simply lithium ion and some of the iron concepts that are out there, there's underground storage, there's pumped hydro, there's all kinds of things that could be developed to allow for that reliability. In some cases, this just may be an overbuild of existing developments that we need to incent as the hedge that you're talking about, so that we can ensure that reliability.
Yep.
And so to your point, it comes back to that, like, what is our current state, and what is our competitive advantage? What is our competitive disadvantage? And then how do we supplement, right?
Yep.
So absolutely 100% correct.
No, and like I said, there's other contextualization points are. If EVs become a bigger thing, ideally, in an ideal world, you use solar to charge EVs while you're at work. In the reality, and without careful grid planning and whatnot, what probably happens is you use solar to charge your batteries when you're at home. And so these are the long-term effects. What is the realistic nature of hydrogen? Virginia is very pro-hydrogen. We recognize that it has a great number of uses. But at the same time, we recognize that we need electrons on the grid now, and using electrons to produce hydrogen to then produce electrons is not necessarily the most
not really a good use of the time. Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's what are the realistic outcomes of things, and where do they fall on both a time scale and a cost-effective scale? Virginia and many other states need to take big swings towards securing that reliable, affordable, increasingly clean energy future. And if we take big chunks out first, whether it's energy efficiency, nuclear, natural gas, solar, wind, whatever the technology is planning to take those big swings,
Mm-hmm.
being as cost effective as possible, is what our energy
Mm-hmm.
plan and other states' energy plans should be working towards, is identifying the most cost effective options and working our way down there. And that will change over time as new technologies evolve, as more information comes to light, as different markets expand, as FERC changes orders or whatnot. Gets like there's a whole list of things that will change that, and that's the importance of the energy.
Ryan, can we say like Commonwealths we get things done? Are we allowed to use kind of like a Hamilton reference
I'm
here?
great with that.
Commonwealths
Commonwealth
we get things done. There
Yep.
we go.
We'll add in Massachusetts and Kentucky next time to
Yeah, that's
cover
exactly.
all of our
There
Commonwealth
we go.
ones. Well, let's go to some questions from the audience. Folks out there, as you're watching, questions jump to mind. Please type them into the Q&A box. Ryan, there's one for you, outstanding. What's the name of the roadmap for Virginia working on the clean energy transition?
Let me pull.
Sure.
What's the name of the roadmap? So the law that was passed in 2020 was the Virginia Clean Economy Act, as well as Chris, I will send you the actual piece of Virginia's code that says what's in it for you to pass around, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And that might be helpful. That outlines specifically what has to be in the energy plan. The most recent energy plan release was the 2022, was Governor Glenn Youngkin's 2022 All American, All the Above Virginia Energy Plan. I can pass that off to Chris as well, so he can share around with the group. I hope I answered your question, person, the Q&A.
And now to make matters worse for you, Ryan, I have to jump because I gotta run out and get to my next meeting. And so I will allow Ryan to answer all the questions on behalf of the great Commonwealth of Virginia and perhaps the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the extent to which he intuits any responses I might provide. It's a real pleasure, Chris and Sam, to join you. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our perspective today.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Brian.
it.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Sure, and certainly not to double and triple down on Virginia, but really, the purpose of this whole training exercise, these 6 webinars, was really just to let states give advice to other states on this planning process. My big takeaways from the 6 conversations we've had is it's never been a more complex energy industry and world, and the new opportunities, the new challenges, they're all very acute and very interesting. And so as a state that somewhat atypically is constantly planning, how do you guys just keep ahead of this, or how do you build a plan that's flexible enough to encounter whatever happens in the next 2 years between these planning cycles? If that's not too much of a question, how do you anticipate just the hecticness that we're feeling in the energy world right now?
So I don't know if there's a good way to we try to be very proactive in terms of, and I should say the governor's energy plan is a living, breathing document. It is meant to be adapted even between the energy plan and the energy plan update as we learn more information. And so that is kind of the approach we take. We've built a very good team here at the Virginia Department of Energy within the policy team in the state energy office to be well versed as subject matter experts in Virginia's power and energy system. And so we are constantly reading, learning, doing analysis, expanding. We are starting to build our own in-house modeling efforts so that we can actually be running these scenarios and looking at, well, what is the realism of these scenarios and their actual effect? What and how when they branch out, how does that change the requirements we need for a successful energy future? And so that's what we are constantly working to do here in the energy office, is learning and bettering ourselves, being good stewards for the citizens of Virginia, so that if some silver bullet panacea technology does come up, we are well in place to not only reap the benefits of that technology from an electricity generation standpoint, but also from an economic development standpoint.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. When will the next Virginia plan be released? Has there been a conversation about a full rewrite after the 2 years or in the 3rd year?
So I can't fully speak to that at this point. It is being worked on. There is not necessarily a release date in mind yet, but it is something that is being worked on and considered. I will say that I imagine a lot of the topics are going to be and the recommendations are going to be very similar to what you see in the 22 energy plan, with the recognition that we need to get things done faster. I think the governor was recently saying we need to build, recently said at the Virginia Energy Summit, we need to build as much as possible as fast as we can in order to secure. And I'm very heavily paraphrasing, so do not directly quote me on that. But the point is still taken of Virginia will need to double its electricity capacity in the next 10 years. So everything we've taken over a century to build will now need to basically be built again in the next 10 years. And so that is a significant opportunity, challenge and opportunity that we face within the great Commonwealth of Virginia. And we look forward to that.
Yeah, quite a challenge. It's really humbling when you say it like that. Well, why don't we give Ryan just a bit of a break, and Sam and I, it's been a lot of fun having these conversations, and we wanted to kind of end with just a little bit of a discussion of what NGA and NASIO can do. I mean, everybody on this call is a member of one of our organizations or both of our organizations, and we're members-based organizations. We try to set up these types of trainings, convenings, in-person events, bespoke research and technical assistance. We really exist to serve you all, and these conversations are actually born out of a number of states approaching both of our organizations and asking questions about comprehensive statewide planning, best practices, copies of other states' plans that were successful. And so we just wanted to take the moment to say, this is members driven. And so questions that stem out of these conversations, things that your state is having challenges with, we exist to serve you all. So please don't be shy about pitching project ideas or things you'd like to know more about. We both have relationships with outside philanthropic funders and through the Federal Department of Energy. And, we have these cooperative agreements that allow us to really explore these things that we hope are useful to all of you. And so just to put that plug in there and talk a little bit more about NGA, we have a whole suite of energy work. This is a small portion of it, but we have a transmission event coming up next month, and we have a number of other workflows. So just wanted to put that out there that we, have the capacity, we exist to serve you all. So if you have ideas or things you're interested in, we'd love to hear from them. And toss it to Sam.
Yeah, so NASIO, we love to offer technical assistance for our members, and we've provided a number of different areas of technical assistance for states looking to get through the planning process. Since this is a big bucket of what we do and what our members do, what the energy offices play a really big role in. For some upcoming technical assistance things we're doing, we'll actually probably be having a roundtable at some point next year on comprehensive energy planning. So stay tuned for that. And we have a history of also just doing direct technical assistance for states as well. We've put together a number of memos, over the last several years, really focusing on various things that states have been requesting of us. So we've provided memos on, say, transportation and grid modernization trends, long-term considerations for state energy plans, modeling considerations, energy efficiency potential studies, state building energy efficiency regulations, decarbonization, support for oil and gas and carbon capture, and also thinking through effective planning strategies for energy offices that are a little bit on the smaller side. And then, and other things like that. We've done a number of these direct technical assistance memos for states. We're also very happy to do them for your own energy office if you have need of it or you have an interest in knowing more about the certain topic. So please reach out to myself or any of my colleagues, and we can get that process started for you and have a nice conversation about that. So we're really looking forward to the next year. Obviously, a lot of states, I think, will be updating their plans in the next year or two. So there's a really great opportunity here to not only bake in the lessons of what we've learned from this training series, but also lessons you may have learned from implementing the IIJA and IRA programs that you've been busy working on, as well as just lessons from the larger energy transition as a whole, because energy is changing very quickly. It used to not be so quick, but it also means it's an exciting time, and there's a lot of really good opportunity to really position your states to be leaders in this area.
Thank you, Sam. And Ryan, you've been a really great sport. Any last thoughts or closing advice you'd like to give to your peers in states and Commonwealth and territories across the country?
Not really. I kind of between this one and the last one, I think I have everything I need to say. I think it is just that broader contextualization and not doing energy planning and especially energy policy making in a vacuum of here's what my state is and not thinking about any of the other states. Also, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I believe Chris will include my email. So feel free to reach out, and I'm more than happy to geek out about energy planning and energy policy, or just technical stuff whenever. So thank you all for coming and listening to me.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Ryan. Really appreciate
Yes,
it.
sir.
And go ahead and pause a minute for any last minute questions in the chat. And if not, I think we'd be good to adjourn. All right. Going once, going twice. Thank you all very much for joining us. This has been a really great project. And thank you, Sam, for all your collaboration coordination on the NASIO side. It's been a fun project to get both of our members together. And I mean, really, truly, the state executive folks and the energy officials, the governor's advisors, you all are driving a lot of the energy policy. As Brian noted, FERC has a role to play, the feds have a role to play, but really a lot of this lives at the state level. And we're really excited to see the enthusiasm and the bright speakers and participants we've had on this.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Chris said. Thank you to all of you, especially to those of you that stuck it out through all 6 webinars. We're really happy to have you here, and we're really happy to teach you, all these different great best practices, throughout the state energy planning process. So hopefully you learned a little something, and hopefully you can apply these to your next state energy plan once you're getting ready to update. As always, feel free to reach out to either of us. We are more than happy to provide, your support and technical assistance. Our job is to make your jobs easier. So please, please reach out and let us know if you have any questions, and we're more than happy to help out.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Hope you have a good afternoon.